This coffee grinder really shook me to the core. I've reviewed a lot of grinders over the years, but it's rare that I come across one that genuinely surprises me in both good and bad ways. But that's exactly what happened here, and that's what we'll focus on in this review. At this point, I pulled over 160 espresso shots with this thing, and for the first 100 shots, I was ready to write it off entirely. But then I discovered something that contradicts everything that most people believe about RPM, so grinding speed, and it really transformed this grinder from disappointing to genuinely impressive. The grinder I'm talking about is of course this one here, the new F74 Navigator from MHW Bomber. Now, before you roll your eyes at another overpriced flatbread grinder, just hear me out. So these aren't your standard 64mm burrs. As the name F74 indicates, they are 74mm burrs. So that's exactly the same size that's used in the legendary Mythos grinder that's found in coffee shops all around the world. And the Mythos grinder is gigantic and expensive, whereas this one is pretty compact and while not cheap, I would say at least affordable considering the price points of grinders today. Both in terms of looks and structure, it reminds me of another grinder that's been making waves over the last couple of years, and that's the Time More Sculptor. But where the Sculptor is more rounded and more elegant, the Navigator has sharper corners, it has exposed bowls, and this kind of industrial vibe. So it's a little bit like the yin and yang of coffee grinders. To be completely honest, I was a little bit put off by the whole Bomber branding the first time I saw it. It just felt a bit odd, and the name itself feels like some auto-generated name for a Counter-Strike player or whatever kids are playing nowadays. And then there's a whole logo with that airplane. But maybe with that whole vibe shift we're seeing today and being on the verge of World War III, we actually need this kind of grinder. Moving on to the physical aspects, the build quality is excellent, everything feels solid and well made. I did actually review another MHW Bomber grinder before, the conical burr model called the Sniper a few years ago. I'll put a link up here in case you haven't seen it. And that grinder was also really well made. While the grinder looks kind of edgy and aggressive in pictures, once it's at your coffee station, it actually feels quite nimble. The design is low profile, and in terms of size, it's quite similar to the Time More Sculptor 078S. So it's not the smallest grinder around, but for having huge flat burrs like this, it's actually quite reasonably sized. Compared to the Time More Sculptor, you'll get a better hopper, where you can actually load your beans without getting a lot of popcorning. It also has a safety feature, so it won't run when the hopper is not in place. You also get a magnetic catch cup that slides in underneath, and it works quite nice. And then you have the RPM dial that is placed on the side instead of being hidden on the back like it is on the Sculptor. The motor is also very quiet, again similar to the Time More grinders. But there are two key differences worth pointing out. One is that Time More has this really nice anti-static knocker. You can twist to knock any grounds loose. MHW Bomber skipped that and went with an anti-static plasma generator instead, which honestly only works so-so. If we're going to stay in this kind of war lingo, I think they kind of shot themselves in the foot by not including a knocker. The grinder has this auto reverse mode, where the burrs spin backwards for a second after grinding to try and push out any leftover grounds. In theory, that's supposed to help with retention, kind of replacing the need for a knocker, but as you'll see in this footage, it doesn't really do that much. I put a piece of paper underneath and remove the catch cup, and as you can see, almost nothing is expelled. What you can do instead though is to use this technique I also use with the fellow oat. I call it the smack my lid up technique. So just lift the lid slightly with your thumb, and then with your two fingers then just push it down like so. Doing this, it kind of creates a bit of movement, a bit of air inside the grinder, and that can really help to push out any leftover grounds. If there's 0.1, 0.2 or a shrapnel stuck somewhere, then it can also help move that along in the system. Overall, the average retention with the grinder is really good. It's like 0.1 to 0.3, and with the lid technique, it gets very close to 0. However, if you go from espresso to pour over, I'd still grind a couple of extra beans and then use a brush underneath the chute. and then finish off with that bellows lid trick to clear everything out, because they use this plastic on the chute which has a bit of static electricity. I think if they had gone for a different material here, it would have less static cling. And a little side note here, but the grinder also comes with a great wooden brush, probably the best brush out of any of the grinder brands I know. As for the modes, there are 3 of them. First is the auto mode, which stops the grinder once it detects there's no more coffee to grind. Then there's the auto reverse mode, which also spins the burrs in the opposite direction. And as mentioned, that doesn't really do much. So I just put the grinder on the last mode, which is the manual mode. And manual mode pretty much just works like any normal grinder. So that means you start and stop the grinder by yourself. But there is actually also a safety feature that kicks in after around 1 to 2 minutes. So not really a big deal if you forget to turn it off. And that's actually not completely unrealistic, because this grinder is super silent when it's running without beans. So you might not even notice that it's running. With beans, it's another situation, but without beans, really super silent. Now let's talk about the flavors themselves, and this is where it gets really interesting. Filtered coffee from this grinder is surprisingly good. I actually brought the grinder down to a friend who owns a cafe and who's been in the coffee business for, I think, over a decade now. And we ran a test against the EK43 in his shop, and his first reaction was, well, it's almost up there. And that tells you something. As the coffee's cooled a bit more, the flavor notes of the EK43 were a bit more popping. The F74 felt a little bit more soft, but it really showed that these burrs are serious and big, and they can produce pretty good flavor clarity. When I compare to other grinders in my collection, there are some ultra filter dedicated burrs that I think do a slightly better job. For instance, I rate the SSP 64mm brew burrs a little bit higher. The Le Brew 64mm brew burrs are also just a bit more clean, a bit more focused, a bit more interesting aftertaste. But we're probably splitting hairs here. I think most people, especially if they're brewing light roast at home and have optimized the water chemistry, I think they'll be really pleased with this grinder. And just to be clear, none of these geeky grinder comparisons really mean that much unless your water is dialed in. So water actually has a bigger impact than grinders. So I would say it's almost the best return of investment. And I do have a course on water optimization if you want a simple and practical way to learn more about it. So I'll leave a link to that down below. In terms of filter coffee presentation, it's quite acidity forward with good space between the notes, kind of subtle body, smooth, but it's there, and it also has a good amount of sweetness, but not overly so. So I will say on a spectrum from, we have SSP brew burrs on one side and kind of like the Time More turbo burrs on the other side, then it's a lot closer to the SSP style. Now, when it comes to espresso, things get even more interesting. I've pulled a bunch of shots with this grinder, more than 160 to be exact, and you might wonder how I can be so precise. Well, the same day I got this grinder, I also received a new espresso machine that can keep track of your number of shots. So this is why I know it. But I got to admit, at the beginning, when I just got the grinder, I was a little bit underwhelmed with the espresso flavors. There's often this thing with grinders, and that is, if they're really great for filter coffee, they're not always that good for espresso, and vice versa. It's about how the grinder blends flavors, manages sweetness, texture, clarity, all these things. And usually, if you get a lot of flavor separation, you get bright acidity for filter, the espresso ends up feeling a little bit hollow, a little bit too sharp. And with this grinder, since the filter coffee was exactly like that, then I got this idea that I want to run it at high RPM, so I can generate some more fines and then get closer to that sweet spot where there's some blending going on, some texture. So in the beginning, I was running the grinder at around 1400, 1500, 1600 RPM, thinking it would add a little bit of that, which could be missing in the grinder. But I didn't really feel like the espresso was tasting great. I'd get the main flavor notes, but then a big part of the cup, probably around 40% of the overall impression, it would be kind of astringent and acidic in a weird, unpleasant way. And if you ever tasted espresso brewed with too much magnesium sulfate added to the water, it gives you that kind of artificial sweetness. So It was a little bit the same with the flavors I got from the grinder. Personally, I prefer espresso that's focused and clean. I want the flavors to be deep, coherent, and not really like scattered or clashing. But with this grinder at the higher RPMs, I was getting too many off notes that didn't seem to belong in the cup. Then somewhere in the middle of my testing, I don't even know why, I started running the grinder at 1000 RPM, and the difference was just mind-blowing. At first I didn't believe it. I thought maybe it was my water or something else that had changed. But after testing it again and again, it was just clear that the flavor profile at 1000 RPM was night and day compared to 1500. At 1000 RPM, the shots were really pleasing. They hit that sweet spot, crowd pleasing, but also interesting enough to work with medium and light roasts. If I compare it to something like the SSP high uniformity 64mm burrs, which a lot of people are familiar with, the Navigator felt quite similar. You get that modern, clear, detailed cup, but still with body and character. It's not one of those weak shots that only kind of exist on the front of your tongue. It actually covers the whole palate pretty well. And this RPM discovery really surprised me. It made me rethink a lot of what I thought I knew. There's been a lot of debate. Does RPM really matter? Does it just shift grind size slightly? Does grinding slower produce fewer fines? Does faster grinding increase them? What I've found is that there's a lot more going on than that. And different burr sets react very differently to changes in RPM. The F74 grinder has really reinforced for me that RPM isn't just like a small tweak, it can completely change the cup. I did run some more tests to get down to the nitty-gritty of this. So first I tried 1200 RPM, but right away I was hit with the same kind of astringency, and that made me focus on the steps below. Then I tried 1100 and the astringency was reduced. At 1000 RPM I saw a good balance. At 900 RPM, I got even better balance, but maybe a little bit more clinical. And then at 800 RPM, I got a more mild shot that was kind of fluffy, sweet, but maybe lacking some intensity. So the big takeaway I want to leave you with is this: run the F74 at 900 to 1000 RPM for espresso and 800 for filter coffee, and then you'll just get excellent results for both brewing methods. And actually, not many grinders can handle a wide range of brew styles this well. One last note, when it comes to dialing in, the grinder is calibrated quite coarse out of the box, but it's very easy to adjust. Just remove this magnetic dial here, and then you can recalibrate it easily until you hit chirp. And it can actually grind super fine. I think Turkish coffee should be no problem. Most of my espresso have been around setting 2, and I grind espresso relatively fine, and that's worked well. So that means you got a really wide range to work with. And what I've found is that it's easy to dial in your shots, but even one click can move the shot quite a bit. For filter coffee, I've been grinding around the coarsest setting down to 8, 9. And that's just because I've calibrated the grinder this way. It might make sense to remove the 0 point a bit coarser, so you get more of a big filter range, but so far this has been totally fine for me. The grinder uses the auger fit system, similar to what you'll find in the Time War 064, and everything in here looks and feels like good quality. It's also fairly easy to open the grinder and access the burr chamber, and the retention inside the chamber itself is really low, even after seasoning with several kilos. Brewing more than 160 shots, like I mentioned, and a bunch of filter coffee. So the grind chamber design reminds me of the Sculptures, but it's just a bit more easy to access because you only have to remove these 4 screws here. Now, of course, we also have to talk about the downsides, and the 74mm burr size is quite unusual. As I mentioned earlier, there's the famous Smithers grinder from Novo Simonelli, and you can probably get those burrs and pop them in. I'm saying probably because with burrs, that can just be a tiny millimeter off, and that can really make or break it. I haven't tried those burrs yet, but if I get enough comments down below, I will probably buy a set and see if it works, and then I can update with the results in a separate blog post. So if that happens, I'll leave a link to that down below. But the important thing with the Mythos burrs is that they are espresso focused. So even though they might be really good for espresso, you might lose the really good filter capabilities of the grinder. Aside from the Mythos burrs, there are a few other burrs in the same size out there, but not all of them have exactly the same inner diameter. So that means that many of them just won't fit. So what we can probably say is that you don't have that many options besides the stock burrs. So you'll have to get to know them and hopefully love them, because you don't really have a huge ecosystem of things to upgrade to. There is another little downside that you need to know about, and that is the sound of the grinder. So this dial indicator here, it has an annoying beep sound, and you can't disable it. And if you use any of the auto modes, it's actually going to beep 3 times at the end after a grinding cycle. If you use it manually, then it will just do 1 beep like this. So depending on how annoyed you are with beep sounds, that might be a deal breaker. But overall, I think you get a lot of grinder for your money. Like most MHW Bomber products, this one really over delivers for what you're paying. Time Morse 064S has gone up in price lately, and it's now in a similar price range as the Navigator. But with the Navigator, you're getting a bigger motor, larger burrs, and in my opinion, better flavor output right out of the box. And I would even say the same versus the 078S. That's just my personal opinion, of course, and there are still many good reasons to go with either of these grinders instead, such as aesthetics and more burr swap options. But if we're just talking about a grinder with a good all-round performance, good all-round user experience, then I think we can finally say that the niche killer is here. It's got the killer look, it's got killer branding, and in the cup, I would also say it kills in that mid-range price class. So if you want to pick it up, I'll leave a link to it down below, and try to find if there are any good deals or coupons, and I'll add those as well. And if you made it all this way, then I'm also curious to get your opinion about the grinder. Could you see yourself owning it? So that's it for today, and I'll see you in another coffee video very soon.